Today we're going to talk about Edward Said. Um, I'm wondering how many of you out there have read him before?
Yeah.
You have? Two of
I
you.
read his book on Orientalism.
Orientalism. What'd you read, Kat?
Also
Orientalism.
Orientalism. Yeah.
Okay. Your readings for today are from a book called Culture and Imperialism. I believe, geez, I should know this. I don't know. Yeah, it comes after. I think he wrote this after Orientalism. Edward Said, well, he died about 15 years ago now, maybe almost 20 years ago. And he was a very eminent professor of, I believe, in the literature department, and his specialty was comparative literature at Columbia. Said is born in Palestine after the war with Israel in the 40s. His family flees to Egypt, and he is raised in Egypt. He is from a Christian Palestinian family. The tip-off is the name Edward. He has a Christian first name. A good 20% of Palestinians are Christians. So, he has proven to be a pretty controversial figure. I was looking this. I'll be honest with you. I've never taught Edward Said before. I have known Edward Said about his work for a very long time, since I was in graduate school in the mid-90s. At that period, Edward Said's work was incredibly popular. That's when I met my wife, who was in graduate studies at Hopkins at the time, and she was all into Said and hitting me over the head with those books, trying to get me on board. And it doesn't hurt that she's also Arabic, so she was really excited about him. He's very, really what he engineered, or what he mobilized, were changes in academia that were very impactful. He brought about big change. I think he was responsible for great change in academia. Prior to the work he did, I don't think there was nearly as much interest in imperialism and colonialism, certainly not the cultural impact of it, for sure. So yeah, he's a very impactful figure. As I was looking over this before class, I was wondering, is this all second nature for you? I don't know. See, I've been in academia for 25 years. So I read this and I think, well, gosh, yeah, we knew this 25 years ago. We've known this for 25 years. Some of the things in here seem commonplace, but I don't know, what you all have to say about that. Did you guys reading this, any of you feel like, yeah, what's new? This is pretty commonly known now? Okay. No takers, huh?
I do think it's pretty commonly known now, but I think it's still valuable to
Okay.
to read.
Good. Anybody else? Anybody think it's not commonly known?
I don't know if this is correct, but I feel like now it's more centered on the cultural mainstream, and things like this take time to work from the academic circle to the subcultural circle, and then it feeds into the main cultural circle. And I think like right now it is very much more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm gonna thank you. Kat said something a second ago I wanted to try and follow up on. Kat, you said it is commonplace, but it's still worth reading and studying. Would you say why?
Just so that, you know, we can be aware of like the patterns of humankind and try and stop it from continuing. Like there was one section where he mentioned that what did he say? Sorry. Shoot. Sorry, I just went blank. But basically it's just important to read this kind of history because it's even though there's this is what he said. He was like, even though there's like not enough, like not a lot of like blank spaces left to like conquer, it's still like a desire that's like inherent in humans and some people to like look for more things to try and take from others. So yeah, I think it's good to be reminded of that in people.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I guess there'll be more to say about this when we dive in a little bit to some of his specific arguments. So I kind of, maybe it's a little unfair of me to ask those questions, but thank you, Kat, for that. You know, one other thing I didn't really talk about is I guess this is a rather different look than other stuff we've read in this class, right? I mean, were you upset with me? Did you kind of say, I think I cheated? I'm having you read a guy writing about literature. You know, this is the literary arts, not the visual arts. And I apologize for that. And maybe you also felt a little shorthanded because maybe you haven't read Conrad or Austen. I certainly am not very well versed in them. I don't think you have to have read them to understand what he's doing here. The extent of my knowledge of Jane Austen is her movies. My wife makes me watch all of them repeatedly. So I feel like I know her. I've seen every version of, what's the one, Pride and Prejudice. I even saw Bride and Prejudice, the Bollywood version, which is very good. I highly recommend it. Any case, you know, so I hope that was okay for you. You know, like I said, you don't have to have read these texts to understand what he's doing here. Let me ask a different question for you all. How did this read? What do you think about Said as a writer? I kind of had a suspicion he's a little dense.
Yeah, I feel like I would go like in and out of being able to follow things. Like sometimes it felt really clear, and then other times it would just be very like flowy, or I don't know how to say it, but and then just all the references. I mean, obviously I haven't read Mansfield Park, but I feel like relative, you know, you could follow what they were saying about what he was saying about Austen and Conrad, but all the other references kind of were like, shoot. So that was a little frustrating, but so it was a mixed bag for me.
Gotcha. Anybody else want to speak to how this read? Well, there's certainly no defenders here, as far as I can tell. This is no bell hooks, right? Or Susan Sontag. Said is an academic, you know, and so he kind of writes like an academic, like a scholar. Yeah, even though his work has been, you know, this is not published. This is published by Vintage, which is a major publisher. So it's not like this is for scholars only. So any case, why don't we talk about some of the issues that come up here? And, you know, I'm not really going to focus too much on Heart of Darkness. There may be more to say about Mansfield Park, and but you know, so he tells us here early on. I'm taking a look at that first section there, starting on page 3. I forget what it's called. Chapter 1. I think that's what it's called. Yay, chapter 1. He says much has been written about the economic and political drivers and the impact of imperialism, but not the cultural aspects. And he makes the point that empire is still with us. This speaks to a point that Kat was making earlier, maybe. Empire is still with us. And it, he says that it, empire, imperialism laid the groundwork for globalization. This has been a recurring theme in the last 30 or so years, that globalization is a new form of imperialism. Wait, that's not supposed to say house. It's supposed to say how so. There you go. Why don't you all tell me, how can you see globalization as a form of imperialism?
Globalization, the way I see it, if we didn't have Britain colonize the whole of most of the world, I feel like a lot of pieces would have, this is just my personal opinion, but like each nation would have their own pride and their own culture, and would be much less willing to accept others just by the fact that humans really don't like change, and by the fact that humans have a lot of pride in things that they consider that are theirs. And like globalization in a way is taking other cultures and accepting other cultures into your culture and aspects of that. And that, I do believe, is a side effect of colonization, being the aspect that forced the other nations to adopt traits of Western Europe, or Britain specifically.
Great. Thank you. Let me ask this question as well. What is globalization? What does it look like? Just so we're clear. How would you define globalization?
The way I kind of see globalization in the most obvious sort of way is in food and products and trade almost. Like, for example, let's say in China, the main staple is rice. Don't really eat burgers, but now there's McDonald's and like fried chicken there. And in America, I know absolutely no one who would eat snails without prompting, but then you have French cuisine that came through, and now it's like this sort of high society kind of thing where like, oh, you try French cuisine, and like, yes, I'll try snails once because it's French, but now without that obvious thought, like it might be good because it's French.
Very good. All right, thank you. Who else? What does globalization look like? Maybe you've been abroad and you've seen it. Tell me what it looks like. Jay mentions burgers.
Well, I feel like it's like a interdependency and influence across like countries and cultures, and it's like probably coming more from the dominant, or like more like powerful countries influencing on less powerful countries through like economics, but through culture and trade and politics.
Excellent.
Kind of to add on to what Rosemary said, I think the interdependency it I think the interdependency was created by, like we talked about last week, how there was a type of forced assimilation in cultures from colonization. And I think that the assimilation kind of laid the groundwork to accepting of other cultures, and then the dependency of the other cultures with each other through trade.
Good. So interdependency, there's interdependency, right? You have to rely, the whole world is interconnected now in the age of globalization. And products that you want can be delivered to your doorstep from an international manufacturer almost overnight, right? And the country and countries are trading with one another for goods they don't have and products they don't have and resources they don't have, and trading what they do have, right? And yet at the same time, Rosemary points out there is a kind of dominance still afoot. So I'm going to cut to the chase, everybody. Which country dominates in the age of globalization? I think you know which one.
US, Britain.
I would suspect it's more the US than Britain, but you can correct me, Blythe. Why don't we flesh this out?
I think in Europe, we dominate a lot more. I mean, Brexit is one question, but like we made Brexit so much about us that there's still like a power of Britain being like the center of Europe, even like, yeah, I guess. But like globalization, I would go.
I agree with Blythe. Britain is definitely the central kind of country that is influencing all the other countries in Europe, but I feel like after World War II, the United States definitely took on like more of the power that comes with it. I suspect because they entered the war late and they had more manpower to kind of spread after that, and they also had the nuclear bombs to kind of push, not like as like a silent threat almost. And they had almost the freedom to be able to be a little more flexible in how they handle things after the war, because they still had more manpower and more industrialization that weren't blown up by the Axis powers.
Yeah. To like further what you're saying, also just like the Cold War in general. Yeah.
Another example is that if you go to Asian countries or Western countries, I can speak for Asian countries because I lived there for a while, and we were in a city. The one thing is we saw someone from America who was African American coming as a national, like abroad student, and I've had so many. I saw so many people look at them and ask them, "Can I touch your hair?" or just touch their hair without asking, and it was really the most disrespectful thing that I've ever seen. And then there are other people that were also international students that were white, that it's like the whole like it was like, oh my god, you're so pale, you're so tall, you're like a star from like those Hollywood movies. And like there's this different perception of different races, and I feel like that definitely comes from like the dominance of culture and how it's viewed.
All right. Thank you. Why don't we talk about some signs of US global influence?
One of the first things that comes to mind for me is I think of like islands and places like Jamaica and Trinidad and stuff like this, where they're like the sign of how well they're doing depends on tourism from us. and that's what makes them like a better location to like visit than like Haiti or the Dominican Republic or anywhere else that isn't like geared towards like having a space for Americans to come.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that is a sign of global influence.
Have you been to those Caribbean islands, Kat?
Yes, I've been to Jamaica like with my family, and my mom's from Haiti, so I've been to a few different islands and have seen this a lot.
And when you go food shopping there, what are you buying? What do you see in the grocery store?
um,
You know what I'm getting
well,
at?
yeah, I mean, when I went to Haiti, I was like staying with like people who were like it wasn't like an American tourist spot, so like I'm eating authentic food. And then when I went to Jamaica with my family, we are staying at a resort where they like had like a chef cook for you, and so like they let you choose the menu and choose what you wanted, and it was like, oh, you can choose like nice popular Jamaican dishes, but you could also choose like hamburgers if you wanted. And it was actually interesting because I remember my dad, when we were there, like asked the chef if he could go with him into town, like if he could get in his car and go with him into town so that he could like leave the resort and have like a in-town experience.
Right.
And the chef was like, no, like why would you want to come with me? Like, why do you want to do that? And my dad is actually British, so yeah, I don't know, it was just funny, but he ended up going with him and was like, you're overcharging us for the fish and the this, but like also they were like, why would you ever want to leave this resort that's like has everything that you could ever need, you know? Why do you want to see the town?
Gotcha.
But yeah, there were options.
Well, if you're interested, I used to teach a class on globalization, and there's a documentary about 20 years old, specifically about the impact of globalization on Jamaica, and it's terribly sad. And I've been to the Caribbean islands a little bit, and you really see the dominance of U.S. culture down there in the kinds of products for sale. I mean, I remember going to Trinidad, I think, or not Trinidad, where were we? Curacao for my honeymoon with my wife, and I wanted to rent a car and see like the island, and I noticed they were not growing anything. there was there was no agriculture, and I discovered later it's because, thanks to globalization, basically, local farmers have been put out of business. Cheaper goods that come in, undermine that. And so what does that mean? That means the entire island is eating imported goods, largely from America. You see the grocery store, it's all American brands. And then the fast food joints all over, right? So, and you see this, you'll travel. Well, I'm going to pause there for a second. Jay has an interesting comment in the chat. I was thinking of Hollywood in terms of US influence. Yes, I'd like to hear more about that.
It's more of Hollywood and like a whole powerhouse of its own. The influence of Hollywood movies and other cultures that are like movies that are being able like easily exported to other countries also affect the cultures in those other countries. Um, Not a movie, but take for example the Beatles. Even in Korea and in China, the fashion that the Beatles had, they also influenced the cultures of that nation, and like the popular mainstream of that culture also starts to adapt some of the either the clothes or the mannerisms of the products that Hollywood puts out.
Mm, yeah. It's been a while since I've read up on, the Hollywood production firms, but my understanding is that at least the last 10 years, these firms make a lot, if not most of their money on some of the movies purely through the international markets, right? They're making stuff for export because they know it might be more popular out there. I mean, I'll ask you all a question. You probably are more knowledgeable about this than me, but are the Marvel movies a worldwide phenomenon?
I know that the Transformers movies are very, very popular in Japan. I also know that there were a lot of racist sentiments about Black Panther in China.
Okay. I was going to say to you all, like, I bet you Tom Cruise is a world-known entity, right? And then I was going to speculate whether the contemporary analog is Robert Downey Jr. Is he known worldwide? I kind of suspect, like you were saying, Jay, that, you know, Hollywood makes cultural products for the entire world, that are pretty much world dominant, right? If not directly, then indirectly, right? And what I mean by that is, you know, I'm not very expert on all these other centers of film, but I've heard of like Bollywood, and I know Egypt has a very important, that's the center of filming for the Arabic world. Nigeria has a very big center for film. How many of these industries are emulating the American model, who are, you know, being influenced and emulating it? I'm reading Blythe's comment on Brexit. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sure. Yeah. But I'm going to make this pitch. I lived in Belgium for a while, and you know, I saw the impact of American fast food culture very strongly over there. First, there were the McDonald's that popped up in villages, and then there were the local chains, hamburger chains that popped up. And in France, they've been complaining for a while, like how, you know, there was a local way of eating, right? You would send the kids home at noon for a dinner, right? That's how they used to do it in France. You would go home from school for dinner. I don't know how they do that, because they would have wine and then I would fall asleep. So I'm good with the American model. Need my Starbucks. But, you know, then in France, you would go back to school until about 4 or 6, and then you would come home and you have a little supper, they called it, right? Le souper. That all went out that went out a few years ago. Wow, it's been a while now. And what was replaced with was the American work schedule and school schedule. And then kids were, you know, in France, the French are always very upset when American culture dominates, and they're very upset that the new generation is enamored by American style fast food. You know, this is a problem for them, because, you know, we prize speed and gratification. And on the continent of Europe, you've had this pushback. They call it the slow food movement. It's big in Italy, for example. So those are some examples that I have, and I was thinking of, like, you know, food. I'll give you another example that I saw myself. My wife, I mentioned, is Arabic. Her family is actually from Syria. She's born here. But I remember going to Syria before the war, and Syria, like Haiti, as Kat was saying, is largely persona non grata in the American hemisphere. And you know what that means? You don't get American products. I remember going to the market there, and I saw all these jeans, and they had like Levi's, Levas, you know, everything but Levi's. It was Levi's, Levas, Levus. I don't know. Like, you get the picture, right? They were playing with this because they couldn't do Levi's. But we were in a hotel, and I got on the television, I was able to get a channel from Saudi Arabia, which is very firmly in the American sphere. And the ads were for Doritos and Cheetos and McDonald's and Dove and Tide. So what it means to be an ally of America is we have stuff to sell you. Blythe, that sounds pretty sweet. I like that.
It was, and they got rid of it.
Oh, you know, related to what we're discussing here, there have been big fights in France about the emergence of Starbucks. I think Starbucks is in Paris now, and they are
not
they are
happy.
not cool.
I was also going to point out about France in general and the like racism that's happening there now, especially about like religious head coverings and how they're trying to push back on that, even though I think if I remember my history rightly, they colonized multiple countries
Yeah.
where religious head coverings, but that's like a big thing that's happening right now in France and especially in Paris.
Yeah, and they don't see that as a kind of racism. They see it as the insistence on universal values, right? Very difficult debate. But here's an interesting point, Blythe. You know, African and Arabic minorities in France, you know, who react. I mean, what kind of music are they turning to? Do you guys know? They're turning to rap. Some of the biggest musicians, like Black musicians in France, and I don't know many because I'm not up to speed, but there was a guy a few years ago, MC Solar, of African descent. So isn't that looks to be also another aspect of the U.S. dominance? You know, look, we're even inspiring the reactionary forces in these countries. You know, I think the case is persuasive. He makes this point on page 8. I think the case is pretty persuasive that if we're going to talk about the empire now, and it's not complete and it's very different, but if globalization and imperialism overlap, and we have to talk about a dominant culture now, it seems largely that it is the United States. It seems. And that has been the nature of the critique of globalization the last 20 years, that globalization is sold as a kind of global phenomenon, for lack of a better word, like this is just increased trade. But really what it is the United States has taken advantage of this in order to impress its culture on the rest of the world very strongly. I could have asked this question differently. I could have said to you all, you know, is America an empire? And I suspect many of you would have said yes, and you would have pointed to other kinds of things, like our literal, like the United States' literal imperial heritage, right? Countries that, places that the nation colonized, of course, and how it expanded across the continent. Here's an interesting question he raises early on. He says, why doesn't the US see itself as an empire? So I'm going to turn that to you guys.
Well, I think there is maybe like a perspective of like thinking that the US is like the good guy who like goes into different countries and like saves them from whatever their issues are, and kind of sees itself as like a role model in some way for the rest of the world. So I feel like empire doesn't have as positive of a connotation anymore. So maybe that's
Oh,
why.
it doesn't have one at all.
Yeah, if it ever did have a positive connotation, but yeah.
Thank you. What else? Who else is going to chime in here? Why doesn't America see itself as an empire? Or maybe you'd like to push back and say they do.
Well, I agree with Rosemary that we think that we are the good guys, and I feel like that also stems from us like early on being like we are a democracy and like all of our people have like say in what we do, unlike some of you other countries, and that like makes us better people, therefore like not an empire where it's like this hierarchy and you know different.
Good. Anybody else?
I was gonna
Or-
say,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was gonna say it's like an excuse to keep the war happening with the Middle East, an excuse to like push capitalism onto other countries by like in a propaganda way of posing oneself as not an empire, but the empire is actually the forced ideologies and the forced like conflicts of helping out, like Rosemary said.
Awesome. Jennifer?
I think probably the democracy itself, like what U.S. defined the imperialism is not like they do not have democracy like they think so.
Yeah, empire has like a monarchical air about it, right? If there's an empire, there's an emperor, right? Good. I remember there was someone, I forget who it was. There was someone in the U.S. government made a statement after the United States got involved in the war in Iraq about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And he said, the United States, it's not in our nature, it's not in our blood, it's not in our culture to conquer and to occupy. We're not an empire. That's not what we do. And that statement was full of shit, of course, because the United States is imperialistic just in different ways and in new ways. One of the reasons we're having this conversation right now is because I want us to talk about the different ways that empire can make itself known, right? One of Said's claims that empire endures, right? The British Empire and the French Empire are gone in a way, but not entirely. And globalization was prepared for by imperialism, and it constitutes a new kind of imperialism. And imperialism can have different looks. And the imperialism of the United States, if it is a kind of imperialism, and I think there's definitely strong degrees of that, it is different from what we've seen in the past. It's what I would call soft power, right? In politics, we distinguish between hard power and soft power, and hard power means your troops go over there, they occupy a country. Soft power is hamburgers, Michael Jackson, Robert Downey. We'll send you Robert Downey Jr. Isn't he dreamy, right? Do you like my jeans? Here, watch my commercials. I bet you would love our Cadillacs, right? And it's a kind of seduction, if you will, I think. Maybe it's something other than seduction too. But yeah, Blythe, great point. Think about the areas in which the United States dominates. We've talked about Hollywood, we've talked about fast food culture. There's also the Wall Street banks. These are the biggest banks in the world. Even when you go to London City, which is the other financial district, you'll find American banks there, like the Goldman Sachs of the world. Referencing what Blythe says right there, think about which companies dominate. This is probably the biggest evidence of US global dominance. What companies dominate? Digital economy, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook. Facebook has 2 billion members. Facebook has 2 billion. Sorry, I got carried away. Who's talking?
Oh, I was just gonna say also, this is not about digital, but that also the English language is, I feel like, kind of the standard language for the world.
It is the international language. It's the language that diplomats learn and business people learn. It's the language that you will speak between two people of totally different languages. Yeah.
Also, education in universities, there's a bunch of international students that come here for Harvard and Yale and the Ivy Leagues. And English is sort of the gatekeeper to all of that. If you don't know English, they won't let you in.
That's a kind of brand.
The TOEFL test in general.
And but think about those universities, like the reason, American universities have become, like Micah, have become so dependent on international students. And that, international, why is this? Because because for tuition, of course, but also, international students flock here for those degrees, and that kind of is an acknowledgement of US cultural influence,
And those
Yeah,
universities.
I'm sorry, Blythe?
Those universities use their international students for their like advertising and their prospectus. Like for example, Micah has a page in their prospectus. It's like a pie chart of like the different countries that like Micah students come from, as like a boast of like, look at how like diverse we are.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Every school in America is like this now. In fact, well, increasingly British and Australian universities have been attractive as well to international students. They relied on them, but the United States, international students want to come here because those degrees, carry some weight at home. Jay, did you want to chime in?
Oh, so in the transfer group that I came in with, we had like a group of 50, 60 people that were in a Instagram group, and we were comparing scholarships, and the international students had way less scholarship than the rest of us.
Yes. That's one of the major reasons that American universities are happy to attract these. In fact, we've seen this kind of disturbing phenomenon at the state college level. Like we've known for a long time that international students want to come to the Ivy Leagues because they're known commodities. But schools like Illinois, University of Illinois, and University of Oregon, and University of Utah, right? Those schools were, devoted to residents of each state. These schools have started to recruit international students because you have cases where the states are often run by Republicans. They will cut the budget on those schools. And then to make up revenue, the schools have to recruit abroad, and they will recruit students who will come and pay the full price. So, but the fact again is that people are willing to do this suggests that these degrees, they carry weight, right? Globally, right? Again, the point I'm making is this is a sign of US soft power, like it or not.
And there is a hierarchy in the international student. Like the student who study in US is on the top, and then Europe, and then the Australia, and then the other countries. So yeah.
So I'm right. I'm just reading the comments here. Yes. That's it, Jay and Blythe. That's it. It's it's in the allure of the international students is tuition driven. And I have to say, I have a son who just applied to colleges, and he applied to a lot of top schools. And I don't know if you guys heard, but the number of applicants this year was double at the top schools. And partly because the SAT was optional this year. But and Harvard, their acceptance rate fell from 6% to 3%, lowest in history. And they were very proud of that. And there were a lot of nice editorials and columns ripping Harvard for that shit. But the point is, there's going to be no lowering of tuition as long as people are falling over one another to go to these schools and pay that tuition, right? You see what I mean? And international students, unfortunately, are part of that crush. What is that, Blythe?
It's something I noticed a lot in my like international student like orientation freshman year, that like normally Asian international students are like forced to assimilate into a Western culture. Like when our international students were introducing themselves to me, they would be using a Western name that they had picked and are using as a preferred name at MICA, rather than asking us to try and learn how to pronounce their name. And it was like almost like all of them, and it seemed like advised to do that, and it makes me really sad. Yeah.
That's interesting. Good. Okay. Yeah. I've noticed that. And I kind of I don't know if this is part of the allure or the reasoning process, but I don't know if you notice, I have a little bit of an odd name for America. And growing up here, I got picked on pretty much a lot. And I remember I was 8 years old, I was like, I'm gonna name my kid Jack, you know, and then I didn't, and now my kids are like, I'm gonna name my kid Jack, and we'll see. Any case. Right. So he makes the point on page 8 that the United States is deeply imperial. You know, empire is with us, even though it looks different, and is exerted differently. And as I hope you can see as we go through this conversation, like it exerts itself in a lot of different and sneaky ways. You know, it's not just the emergence of McDonald's in your village. It's the decision for, you know, how you're going to live your life, what your schedule might look like. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. It's not important really, but it has to do with coffee. So I think it's interesting. About 10 years ago, into Italy, and I was with my mother-in-law. We went for lunch, and she says, she says, I want a salad and I want a cappuccino. And the waiter looked at her and said, no. I was amazed. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about, man? What do you mean, no? In America, that doesn't exist, right? The customer is always right. And I said, excuse me? And the waiter said, no, you don't drink cappuccino in the afternoon, and you don't drink it with your salad. I will get you wine. And my mother-in-law doesn't drink alcohol. She's like, no, I can't. Italians are funny that way. My 3-year-old daughter wanted pasta with butter, and the waiter said, no. You got to have it, the sauce. It's got to have the flavor. I was like, what is this place? But the point I was making about coffee is that in Italy, for example, they have very strong rules, and France as well. They have very strict rules. You drink cafe au lait in the morning. You drink coffee, a certain type of coffee at 3, you know. And I remember my family from Belgium came over here, and I picked them up at the airport, and I had like a venti Starbucks, and they're at 2 p.m. and they're like, what is going on here? Why are you, what is this? Why are you drinking coffee at 2 p.m.? You know? And now Starbucks has landed, right? Starbucks has landed in, it's in London. I know that. It has made headway into Paris with some fighting. And Starbucks, the reason I'm harping on Starbucks is because it's kind of a pretty important cultural phenomenon, right? Americans drink coffee, a lot of it, very strong, all the time. And like in Sweden, you have coffee break at 3 in the afternoon. You get a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and it's a break, and it's fucking delicious. That's not how we operate, right? We view coffee as fuel. What do we need the fuel for? I gotta work hard, man, right? American culture is workaholic to the hilt, and the coffee is emblematic of that, right? So the fact that that Starbucks has landed in London and in France is infiltrating, pretty soon those guys are gonna be working, 17-hour days, and just like us in a way. Any case.
It's also sad to like local businesses. I remember growing up, like my city, Bristol, like when I was about 14, 15, we started getting like Starbucks, Costa, and before that we'd had like independent coffee brands that have basically disappeared
Yeah.
since then.
I mean, listen, Blythe, the idea of the chain that is pioneered by US capitalism. So I know Costa is not an American chain, but the whole idea of the chain is American, you know?
Oh, and there is a very interesting thing is that like the famous people online, there's once like before they always like when they take photos they always have a like Starbucks coffee in their hand. Right now it's not that much, but still there are a lot of people do that. So even though they do not drink it, so it's fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Good. Yeah. Good. All right. What do you mean there, Blythe? The influencer aesthetic and globalization. What do you mean by that? Oh, you're
Like,
talking.
just like what they were saying, and also
Okay.
about like pushing products and cultural appropriation and merging of cultures for the fashion trend through influencers. Yeah.
I mean, just think about like, you know, when I lived in Europe many years ago, I remember you would turn on the TV and you'd see all these American shows, you know, dubbed or translated. And what are they transmitting to the rest of the world? They're transmitting American tastes, things that we take for granted, right? The suburban home that's pretty spacious with a backyard and a 2-car garage. You know, I mean, that is the model that our entertainment industry champions to the whole world, right? And in a way kind of normalizes, you know, which is from a sustainability standpoint, it's kind of a disaster because our carbon footprint is out of control. You know, on that note, I've been reading that you know, the rates of meat eating, and in particular like beef, is going through the roof in countries as their middle class grows. And we've seen this in China and India and Brazil. And, you know, again, emulating an American diet in a way. And that's kind of disastrous, you know? It's hard to deny people this diet, and it's hard to deny people their cars when we're living it up over here. And then we're selling that image, right? To the whole world. Yeah. The front lawn with the grass lawn with not a weed in it, right? My kids are really into Modern Family now. Very funny show, but you know, just turn it on sometime and mute it and just look at it critically and analytic and be like, what values are being transmitted there? Their houses are huge and sumptuous, you know, in a way. What does that, you know, how does that stoke consumerism? How does that stoke global consumerism, you know, that American firms largely take advantage of? All right. Good. We've made our point. America's empire. Fuck yeah. But let's get to his main point here. On page 10, he relates his driving question, Edward Said does. He says at the top of the page, he says, that is the question that concerns me here. Given the initial, perhaps obscurely derived and motivated move towards empire from Europe to the rest of the world, how did the idea and the practice of it gain the consistency and density of continuous enterprise, which it did by the latter part of the 19th century? How did the idea of empire, how did its idea and its practice gain the consistency and density of continuous enterprise, that this is continual expansion, right? That is his question. And he points out something really that struck me, the top of page 11. In India, by the 1930s, 4,000 British civil servants assisted by 60,000 soldiers and 90,000 civilians had billeted themselves upon a country of 300 million persons. The will, self-confidence, even arrogance necessary to maintain such a state of affairs can only be guessed at. The will, self-confidence, and arrogance, right? So this is leading to his claim that, scholars have paid a lot of attention to the economic and political influences, impact, and drivers of empire. But Jesus Christ, what is preparing the arrogance and the self-confidence of these colonizers? There is a cultural impact here that prepares the whole damn thing. Culture prepares empire and the imperial drive. It normalizes it, it solidifies it, and it sanctions it. And it drives it on. And then he gives a beautiful quote here in the bottom of page 12 from, who is this? This is from William Blake. Well, here's another nice quote. I'm reading from the bottom of 12. He says, "What I want to examine is how the processes of imperialism occurred beyond the level of economic laws and political decisions, and by predisposition by the authority of recognizable cultural formations, by continuing consolidation within education, literature, and the visual and musical arts, were manifested at another very significant level, that of the national culture, which we have tended to sanitize as a realm of unchanging intellectual monuments, free from worldly affiliations." William Blake is unrestrained on this point. The foundation of empire, he says, is art and science. Remove them or degrade them, and the empire is no more. Empire follows art, and not vice versa. Empire follows art. So that's the main claim. Empire follows art, understood as the artistic productions that are central to culture. It prepares the way for empire. It normalizes the demands, the expectations, and the desires. It normalizes the privilege. Okay? It would be very interesting to think, I hadn't prepared at all in this regard, but it would be very interesting to think about, and maybe I could ask you all to do that, like to think about the ways in which culture prepares for American imperialism. How does American culture prepare for the American brand of imperialism? I'm going to drop that question for a second and see if anybody thinks of anything. It's probably made tricky because Americans don't see themselves as imperialists, right? Well, I'm going to put the question in the chat and you can think about it. How does culture prepare the way for or enable American imperialism?
I mean, we
Globalization.
like I did talk about Hollywood. I feel like that really spreads American culture, and we have soft influence for imperialism, and it feels more, like you said, it feels a lot like seduction or like it coercion almost. And it doesn't feel like coercion because when you see the like the image of Americans who live it up and like have these nice houses, eat really rich foods, and they're like, I want to be like that. And the best way to convince someone of doing something is to make them believe that it is their choice. When you watch a film or read a story, your inhibition, not your inhibitions, but like you have suspended disbelief. And through that, they adopt these like desires for what Americans have but only the type that is idealistically portrayed in Hollywood movies.
Mm.
And that paves a way for, that really softens the road for Americans to like push their ideals and our specific brand of imperialism.
Nice.
I
Good.
think also like the American culture of like everyone being independent and kind of like, yeah, self-sufficient in a way, or just like everyone has their own car, everyone has their own house. Everyone needs to like go out and like claim their piece of land. And so I'm sure that carries through so much.
Good. How are American values transmitted in or through our cultural exports?
We also have, there are also countries where individual freedom is extremely limited, and American cultures would seem like almost dreamlike to them. One example would be India and their arranged marriage system, and how the women can't really refuse
Yeah.
much of anything, or even Middle Eastern. My friend, when she was 16, was visiting with their mother, and one man just came up to her mother at a cafe and was like, "I will trade 3 goats for your daughter." And I'm like, she got a picture of that, so I'm inclined to believe that it was true.
Yeah, good point. I mean, about the marriage thing for sure. I mean, I can't tell you this enough. In many, many cultures around the world, I mean, I've said this in my classes before. It might come as a surprise. I don't know if I told you guys this, but I mean, the idea of romantic love is really young. It's new. That's a 20th century idea, right?
It's around industrialization where women start to work and excess is generated, where you have a little more freedom to explore that kind of thing. Before then, it is and it's not an it's a transaction of funds and wealth and how you can survive and create children and like pass down your wealth and stuff like that.
See, I think it's even later. I mean, I believe you, Jay. I'm sure the scholarship bears that out, but I think for many, many people, it's even later than that. And here's my proof. Think about your grandparents. Think about your great grandparents. There's an excellent chance they did not marry for love, right? That's not to say it was an arranged marriage, but they married for other things. And you know, as my grandmother used to say, she did not marry for love. She said, "I grew to love him." About my grandfather. Why am I saying this? Because many cultures around the world, that is the idea of marrying for romantic love is still rather alien. So I just back up your point, Jay, that like, yeah, I think like, what does Hollywood do great? Hollywood does the rom-com really well. Like the idea of true love and individualism, and you'll be gobsmacked when you see the person of your dreams, and you can follow your heart, that kind of a thing, right? That's the nature of our individuals in this country, which is transmitted very firmly in our movies. Yes. Disney. Oh my God, Blythe. I can't believe we talk about American Empire and it took us an hour and 15 minutes to talk about Disney. Shit, people, Disney is awful. And I know you probably want to say something, but as the teacher, I will take a little bit of a monopolistic stance and I will issue the first assault. My daughter, well, all my kids are there, 10 years ago, they were all in pre-primary school. And I remember it came around for Halloween and I went down there to the pre-primary school. And my son, for some reason, wanted to be a postman. Very curious. I was like, really? But whatever. And then the next year, he wanted to be a cowboy. So things were in flux. But every girl wanted to be a princess. And I was like, what the fuck is this? What the fuck is this? And then I realized it's Disney. It's goddamn Disney. everybody. All right, I'm done. Anybody want to pile on? Or
I think that the Disney brand and the idea of being a princess, and I don't know, like every single girl, almost every single Disney female is like a princess in some way. Even Princess in the Frog, she becomes a princess at the end. And it sells this image that if you're a princess, you can get the man, get that true love, acknowledge your like dreams, but also get married at the same time. I'm like, do you really need the last part of that though? And it still sells like you have to be married to be happy. That's your happily ever after. I'm like, but why? I'm sorry, that's just my personal gripe.
Well, maybe I should leave you guys, let you guys explain the problem. What is the problem with the whole princess motif specifically? I mean, I'm sure you will give me a very healthy feminist answer, right?
You don't have to have
Yes.
long blonde hair and a pretty dress to be a woman.
There's the physical ideal, you know.
There is the physical, and I would like to add on every single Mulan doll, it's not her in warrior clothing. That's not stressed. It's always her in the arranged marriage clothing. And I'm like,
I mean, my instinct when I see all the girls who want to be princesses, I'm like, that's not very enlightened. This is not very progressive 21st century. You know, surely Gloria Steinem is puking somewhere. Surely. But I mean, feminism, I don't teach it. So I'm not sure I can articulate this very well, but I feel like there's something really wrong there. Regressive is the word. There's something pretty regressive. Any case, okay, there's one of my beefs. Yeah, Disney, it's just like, forget about it. I mean, there's Disney Europe. Isn't there a Disney in Tokyo now? Hello?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely like one in Paris that actually almost failed when it was opened. And then after that one, it slowly became a success. They started taking them to like other countries too. But the company itself, like they absorb a lot of other like TV and media companies, and like they're just like ever expanding. Yeah, so in that way, they're an empire too, like the business side of things.
Oh my God, Blythe, what a great point. Our companies act like empires. I mean, one thing we've kind of danced around, but really haven't put our finger on is capitalism. You know, the nature and specifically the way that America practices capitalism is very different from the way other countries do, right? Capitalism in Europe is not quite as rough. It doesn't have as many, you know, casualties. For example, in Germany, companies are run, the unions always have votes on the board. Not so in America. We prioritize profit, thanks to Milton Friedman. So the nature of, oh my God, look at that, Jay. Yep, see, they're all over Disney. That's, you know, so, you know, the way our corporations operate globally, they operate ruthlessly. And that's a form of imperialism, sure. Sure.
Just Nestle as a brand. Can I just put that out there?
Which one?
Nestle.
Nestle. Is that American though?
I'm pretty sure now they are, but they've absorbed like so many different like food and production that pretty much, I think it was like a third of all like branded food products or like Nestle products or something crazy like that. They own like 6 different water bottle companies. And yeah.
Yeah, good. Great. Good. All right, let me move further here with you know, his claim. There's more to say, by the way. I think, you know, if you wanted to this might be an interesting option for a research paper here, how in the case, applying Said's thesis to the case of, American imperialism, how does culture prepare us for imperialism? How does it normalize it? You'd have to look at the way, I think what this is very significant in the second chapter I gave you, which is about Jane Austen, the way he talks about how Jane Austen talks about space, right? That normalized, like secretly normalized the expansion of empire, right? What is there? Where does American culture do that on our end? Let me move a little further. One thing that's kind of interesting about Said here is also his intent. Why is he? What is he up to? What is the goal of his project? And this is what he says on 18 at the very bottom. He says, I want first to consider the actualities of the intellectual terrains, both common and discrepant in post-imperial public discourse, especially considering what in this discourse gives rise to encourages the rhetoric and politics of blame. The rhetoric and politics of blame. He's worried about that. The rhetoric and politics of blame. He sees that at play in colonial discourse, and he is going to want to dissipate that. Makes me wonder what he would have to say in this day and age of identity politics and cancel culture. But let me go on. He says, then using the perspectives and methods of what might be called a comparative literature imperialism, I shall consider the ways in which a reconsidered or revised notion of how a post-imperial intellectual attitude might expand the overlapping community between metropolitan and formerly colonized societies. By looking at the different experiences contrapuntally as making up a set of what I call intertwined and overlapping histories, I should try to formulate an alternative both to a politics of blame and to the even more destructive politics of confrontation and hostility. Wow, this is not written very nicely. This is kind of a mouthful, so what is he really? I'm going to break it down for you all here. What's he saying? I mean, I think he's going to say, he tells at the end, he wants to transcend a destructive politics of confrontation and a politics of blame. The colonized blaming the colonizer, and the colonizer, exhibiting disdain or hostility. He wants to overcome the two, essentially by pointing out, what a close study of imperialism tells us is that both the imperial literature and the resistance literature, which was your last reading for today, that the histories of countries is so intertwined. You can't pull them apart, right? A political reaction, as he points out in the last chapter, is always carved out and laid out with an eye to the colonizer. And he points out even how a lot of these colonial writers, they adopt Western tropes, like, the voyage, the idea of the voyage. James Joyce, you might not have thought about this, but James Joyce is he's a colonial writer in the sense that, he was writing over and against, Ireland was a colony of England up until the 1920s. And, James Joyce is writing as a reaction to that imperial relationship. And what he does, for those, I don't know if you guys have read Ulysses, but that is his name Ulysses, Odysseus. It's a readaptation of the story of Odysseus, who travels, the ancient Greek sea, Cyclops, sirens, et cetera, Ulysses is about Leopold Bloom in 1920, still in colonial, as a colony of England in 1920 Dublin, making the same trip. And then Said talks about, or a similar, trip with this figure is like a Cyclops, this figure is like a sirens. It's been 30 years since I read Ulysses. I don't remember. It's supposedly a classic. I had a hard time with it. And I'm half Irish. I should dig him, but I can't. In any case, the other thing I want to tell you all is he points out in the last chapter also how a lot of colonial writers decided that they would repurpose The Tempest. You guys know The Tempest by Shakespeare, which is the story of a ship blows up on an island, and Prospero is there with his daughter and Caliban. I almost said Taliban, Caliban, and then the fairy, whose name I forget. And it is understood to be very rich in like colonial themes, because Prospero is like a visitor, etc. And a lot of colonial writers, neo-colonial writers in the 20th century, they took over The Tempest and they rewrote it again. Why am I telling you this? Said's point is, you know, he wants to try to undermine the politics of confrontation, the politics of blame, by pointing out that the colonizer and the colonized, their histories are so intertwined. They cannot be pulled apart, you know. They're deeply related in a way. He puts this again on the next page, 19, right at the bottom of that middle paragraph. Says, what we need to do is to look at these matters as a network of interdependent histories. There you go. That it would be inaccurate and senseless to repress, useful and interesting to understand. These are interdependent histories. These colonized and colonizers. These are interdependent histories. And he thinks that his study might disarm patriotism and chauvinism. Why patriotism? Well, patriotism is this idea, you know, I guess it would also disarm nationalism. And you know, I can speak more to that. How, and I think chauvinism is, you know, when we talk about chauvinism, we're thinking of this on page 20, cultural chauvinism. You know, he thinks his form of history is going to undermine, you know, nationalism and cultural chauvinism by this. You know, so I find it very curious. You know, we kind of struggle with this debate in America. Like, what does it mean to be an American? And you have the Trump phenomenon has brought into the spotlight this group of Americans. They're white and they're Christian, and they, you know, they see themselves as emblematic of the American nation. Well, that's kind of bullshitty, because a lot of those guys just got here in the last century and a half, right? I have cousins who, I mean, whose mother came from Ireland, and they were full on Trump. And I'm like, what is your problem? You're an immigrant, for Christ's sake, you know. The French, I find funny for many reasons. French people are just humorous in general, not wittingly. I like to laugh at them. And French nationalists are very funny because they're like, oh, to be French, I'm French through and through. If you go back 150 years ago, only 60% of the French nation spoke French. In 150 years ago, France was a multilingual country. You had Flemish in the north, German in the east, Provençal in the south, Basque in the west, Breton, Norman. You had like 18 different. And by the way, those people, you know, we now know that like people have been migrating in and out of these European countries for the last 50 years. What's the point? Nationalism has a false essentialism at its core, right? Essentialism. To be French is just to speak a language, but you were not speaking French. Your people were not speaking French 150 years ago, and your people were immigrants from Italy 200 years ago, you know? And you could go through each of the nationalist movements in Europe and point out the same things, right? Again, my mother's from Ireland. The Irish are mutts. My mother has jet black hair because she's what they call the Black Irish, related to supposedly the Spanish Armada crashed up on the west coast of Ireland. You know, if you study the Irish genes, you'll find Viking. You know, you'll find French. You'll find Celt. It's a fucking mess. But guess what? every country's a fucking mess. There's no purity there, right? So, you know, I think what Said is doing here is he's trying to point out that, like, if we understand this, the messiness of history, the interdependence of these groups, that is something that can disarm cultural chauvinism.
This is only a semi-related point, but you talking about that and how we need to realize that within Europe also reminds me about like the systematic like approach of not allowing indigenous people that belong to multiple like I don't know the proper wording, so I'm really sorry. Multiple, I guess, tribes of indigenous people in the US to claim that they are part of that unless they have to choose one. They can't choose multiple. There's no such thing as like mixed indigeneity due to like this like the way the US has it like set up. Even though like you see white people being like, I'm 10% German.
Yeah.
Like, if they can claim that they're, you know, yeah, it's wild.
Good point. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this whole critique was seared in my mind many years ago. I read the philosopher Seneca. He was a Roman philosopher, and he got in trouble with the Emperor Nero, and he was banished to the island of Corsica. Not bad for some. In any case, he's sitting over there and he writes a letter to his mother, and he says, "Mother, you should, you know, I know you're missing me, and you're saying why I'm missing home. But let me tell you, nobody has a home. I'm from the city called Rome. Guess what? Rome is a mishmash. I like to tell my students, Rome 2,000 years ago looked like New York City today or London. You would have walked in the street and you would have seen all people from all kinds of, you know, well, of all colors and races, for example. And so do you know what that means for 20th century Italians? Same thing. I hope I don't upset anybody. They're a mongrel in a way. I know mongrel has a bad connotation, but like everybody, there is no ethnic purity. That is a myth. It's a myth. In any case. Let me get into something here. I want to talk about the chapter on Jane Austen, which starts around page 80, because I think what he does here is it gives a really good insight into his method, into, you know, what he's looking for, where he sees this secret cultural preparation at work. I don't remember much about Mansfield Park. I really don't. I know there's a very good BBC version with Harold Pinter, and I forget who else. My wife has made me watch it, and I probably fell asleep. But so I'm going to talk about Mansfield Park, and I really don't know much. Main character being Fanny. She comes to her uncle's estate at the age of 10. The uncle is gone. The uncle has to busy himself with the plantation in Antigua overseas. So he's not there. Said makes a big deal about this guy's appearance at Mansfield Park, which is the home turf, which is the home property. And he is like the lord of that property. And when he's away, he's the lord of another property, right? So there's kind of an imperialism at miniature when this guy shows up. And in this chapter about Jane Austen, he is not so concerned with the justification of an empire, but what predisposed Europeans to venture out in this enterprise in the first place. You know, what set their appetites running and made them think this was okay. And he points out, first of all, he cites John Stuart Mill. Mill, you know, Mill is actually, I mean, so I think I told you guys this. I mean, my specialty is political philosophy. That's my thing. Mill is a huge thinker when it comes to liberal democracy. In many ways, he's the father of it. He gives, in the mid-1800s, he gives the premier articulation of free speech, why it should be. And he gives a famous argument against censorship, that even the Supreme Court justices today still cite. He was one of the early proponents of women's rights, workers' rights, rights for the poor. And yet he also articulates an idea called paternalism. Basically, he says, you know, he says, you know, all rational adults have certain inalienable rights. This sounds familiar to Americans or people from the, from this country. All individuals, all rational individuals have inalienable rights, right to speech, right to assembly, things like that. But you hear what I said? I said all rational adults. That presupposes there are some that don't. There are irrational. Now he says, Mills says, this includes children, and this includes those who, well, are, mentally disabled. I forget how he puts it. Well, this kind of lays the groundwork and says there are some who are able for these rights. There's some who earn them and deserve them, and there are some who don't because they're not ready for them, right? And this sounds now to our ears, this starts to sound like imperialism, right? The imperialists justified what they were doing as a form of paternalism. Here's a quote on page 81 at the top. She says, why that should be so, why sacred obligation on one front should not be binding on another, why rights accepted in one may be denied in another, are questions best understood in terms of a culture well-grounded in moral, economic, and even metaphysical norms designed to approve a satisfying local, that is European order, and to permit the abrogation of the right to a similar order abroad. Basically, the colonizer says to the colonized, we have a language of rights and we have equal rights, but you are not displaying the kind of readiness to inherit those rights. And so we are going to be making decisions for you, right? I'm going to show you guys something. I just got the New Atlantic. I feel like a salesperson here, but if you should get it when you can read other things soon. The title is Return the National Parks to the Tribes. And this is a feature like Yellowstone and Yosemite. Return the National Parks to the Tribes. I haven't read the article yet, but I was reading some of the captions of the images, and there's one picture in here that really kind of struck me. I'm going to share it with you. It's really terrible. This image here at the bottom. And what it is, I'm going to go even closer so you can see. It is, these are all white men. You might have noticed this is North Dakota in the 1930s. And you'll see here in the corner above my finger, there's one man crying. And what is this? Well, the caption reads, George Gillette, the chairman of the Fort Berthold Indian Tribal Business Council, weeps as more than 150,000 acres of the Fort Berthold Reservation, North Dakota, are signed away for the Garrison Dam and Reservoir Project. He's crying because all these white men are taking his property and they're abrogating the agreed on treaties. Pretty despicable stuff. But the point I'm making is, this was justified in the eyes of these white men because the Native Americans are not doing anything productive with their land. So their rights, sorry, we're going to ignore them. Okay. So paternalism was already very well culturally ingrained in the West before the imperial project ramps up. This is for a totally different class, but you'll notice there is a politically uncomfortable point that this paternalism was deeply ingrained in the founding documents of liberal democracy itself, which that sucks. And that probably says something pretty, that's probably a likely indictment of liberal democracy. But again, take my political theory class in the fall if you're interested in hearing about that. any case, paternalism was already culturally ingrained, right? These empires that start traveling overseas in the 1800s, they're democracies. You know, I mean, France is not great democracies, but they're rather democratic. Britain, Parliament is growing in power throughout the 1800s. So, you know, how are these democratic nations able to, where do they get off creating empires? Well, paternalism. Okay. But let me get deeper here into Jane Austen, and then we can break for the day. He says that the literature in the 1800s prepares for an imperialism by its spatial expressions. That's the quote. It prepares for imperialism by its spatial expressions. How it describes the spatial outlook of characters. And what he does then is he looks into Jane Austen and he gives all these slight examples, very small, that most people would not pay attention to, you might ignore, that indicate the disposition. Here's some examples, the bottom of 82. He goes on quickly to cite the idea of emigration to the colonies. I don't know who he's talking about here. I think he's a literary critic. As one such image prevailing in various novels by Dickens, the Brontes, Gaskell, and rightly shows that new rural societies, all colonial, enter the imaginative metropolitan economy of English literature via Kipling, Orwell, and Maugham. After 1880, there comes a dramatic extension of landscape and social relations. This corresponds more or less exactly with the age of empire, right? So these are slight things, right? But the repeated reference to emigration to the colonies. He also talks about, you know, this character in Jane Austen's book, Fanny, how she changes in her own perception of space. And here's another example on page 88. I believe he's quoting her here. Looking at the bottom part of that quote. She was at home, middle of 88. She was at home, but alas, was not such a home. She had not such a welcome. As she checked herself, she was unreasonable. A day or two might show the difference. She only was to blame, yet she thought it would not have been so at Manfield. No, in her uncle's house, there would have been a consideration of times and seasons, a regulation of subject, of propriety, and attention towards every body, which there was not here. Now, what does he do with this passage? He notes that she ascribes to the home turf, Mansfield, comfort, order, organization, propriety. And what does that mean? Well, that implies that these are properties that are not found outside it. It's kind of an imperialist version, if you will. She goes on, Edward Said goes on now at the bottom of 88. In too small space, you cannot see clearly. You cannot think clearly. You cannot have regulation or attention of the proper sort. You need more space. You can't do it in too small space. The fineness of Austen's detail. The solitary candle was held between himself and the paper without any reference to her possible convenience. The fineness of Austen's detail renders very precisely the dangers of unsociability, of lonely insularity, of diminished awareness that are rectified in larger and better administrated spaces. We need larger and better administered spaces. Read empire, read colonies. We need more space. We need to spread out. Read empire. We cannot be locked in lonely insularity. Read empire, spread your wings, etc., etc. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Is he saying that Austen was intentional in that type of subtle detail or not. I couldn't.
Yeah, I'm not sure. He, at one point, he struggles with that, with her intention, right? Because he says, you know, I know she was not an abolitionist. I think I'm going to read that quote in a second, but like, she certainly didn't approve of what was going on in these plantations. One thing I do remember from Mansfield Park is that I believe one of Fanny's cousins had been over there and comes back, and he had been tormented by what he saw, and he sketches some of the things. And one of the things he sketches is a slave being raped by a white overseer. And so, you know, Austen certainly, you know, in doing so, suggests that she realizes there's something wrong going on here, right? But, you know, he struggles with, you know, how is she, you know, where does she stand on that issue? I guess that's slightly different from what you're asking, which is like, did she intentionally write this? Like, I'm going to write a great book that is going to justify empire. I think his point is like, she could hardly help it. Like, this is already ingrained in people's thinking. And then what do cultural creations like this do? They ingrain it even deeper. People hear that are like, oh yes, small spaces are not good enough. I need to spread my wings. And to be British is to, you know, extend order into other places around the world, things like that. But I think his point is that, because he has an early quote, actually, I think this is the quote that opens the reading here on page 4. It's T.S. Eliot, when he says, you know, an individual talent works within a tradition that cannot be inherited, that can only be obtained by great labor. You know, authors are in a way captives of history. They can't help but relay values, but in so doing, they repackage them and make them even more inured, even more culturally ingrained. So that's what I would say to that. Is that okay? Was that clear? Yeah. Anybody else? Other questions or comments? All right. We just have a few more minutes, so let's finalize a few other things here. You know, another example of how he does his analysis of how empire is, you know, kind of casually and secretly implied through the work. Here's a quote on page 93, how, you know, one of the interesting dynamics of Mansfield Park is that the family's wealth is reliant on the plantations in Antigua. So Mansfield Park, its fortunes rely on something that is remote and invisible, and yet in a way always kind of present. And yet Antigua is hardly ever mentioned by name in the book. He says in the middle of 93, take once again the casual references to Antigua, the ease with which Sir Thomas's needs in England are met by a Caribbean sojourn, the uninflected, unreflective citations of Antigua. Blah, blah, blah. They stand for a significance out there that frames a genuinely important action here. What's really important is happening here. It's not important happening out there. Yet these signs of abroad include, even as they repress, a rich and complex history which has since achieved a status that the Bertrams of Price and Austen herself could not recognize. Okay. So it's an out there, an alien territory that is referenced, but is like murky, you know, the way the imperialist powers see the colonies. Interesting. I've been saying throughout that I think like Said, you know, what's interesting about Said is like, in academia, identity politics owes a lot to him, because he is the one who really, you know, speaks up for the voice of the colonized, you know. And yet, right today, you know, throughout academia, there is a move away from what is perceived to be, you know, Western imperialistic literature, for example, right? Or the classics. And yet look what he says on page 96. He says, you know, middle paragraph, yes, Austen belonged to a slave-owning society. And, you know, as I mentioned, her treatment of slavery in the book is ambivalent at best, right? Yes, she belonged to a slave-owning society, but do we therefore jettison her novels? No. I would argue, if we take seriously our intellectual and interpretive vocation to make connections, to deal with as much as the evidence as possible fully, and actually to read what is there and not there, above all, to see complementarity and interdependence instead of isolated, venerated, or formalized experience that excludes and forbids the hybridizing intrusions of human history. Jesus Christ, he really writes, what is he saying here? Yeah, I mean, Austen is in, I think what he wants to say is that Austen is impacted by slavery too, you know, impacted and influenced by slavery in turn, right? That's the complementarity and the interdependence, you know, that would forbid the hybridizing intrusions of human history, right? Human history is hybrid when it intrudes. Good. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about pretty much. So yeah, okay, that's pretty much it. You know, so again, like this chapter here on Austen, I think gives you the best evidence for his method, for what he intends to do and how he intends to do it. You know, how do cultural and artistic productions validate an imperial outlook in implicit ways, in hidden ways, you know? He picks up on things that most scholars would hardly notice at all, right? He acknowledges, right? He says, I know I'm reading this book in a different way, and it's not incompatible with other ways of reading this book, but I'm reading it in a totally different way. And I think, you know, we need to read texts in multiple ways. So, okay. Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay. Well, I mean, we only have 5 minutes left, so that's hardly enough time, I think, to get into the other sections. So I'm going to leave it there, I think. But I will stick around if anybody wants to talk to me. Okay. And you all know your marching orders for next week. If you have not emailed me your paper topic, I need it. And then I'll respond. I'll let you know if you're good to go.
Can I talk to you?
Sure. I think most of you guys have signed off and you're ready to go. So dive into the research, see what you find. If you have any questions, email me. I will send you the sign-up sheet very soon for these, maybe after class, for these paper conferences next week. And then I will see you each individually, okay? All right. And yes, you may stick around and chat with me if you want. I'm not going anywhere. All right. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. Good discussion today.